Everyone, welcome to House Economic Matters Committee. Today is Thursday, January 19th. Today we have a briefing from the Alcohol Tobacco Commission. I want to welcome Jeff Kelly and members of his commission. You can come on up and begin the briefing whenever you're ready.
Yeah, come up here. Why don't you come over here? Yep. Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Thank you. My name is Jeff Kelly. I'm the Executive Director of the Alcohol Tobacco Commission, and arguably one of the best jobs in the state is the one I have, so I appreciate the opportunity to have it. And if I could just take a moment, Mr. Chair, and introduce a couple of our commissioners who are here as well. I appreciate them coming in. They wanted to have an opportunity to meet with you, and I don't know if there's time perhaps for them just to make a quick comment, but thank you. Our chairman, Mr. Al Silverstein, and our commissioner, Betty Buck. Probably most of you don't know Betty, because she's been involved in the alcohol trade here for longer than me. So these are our two. Say hello, at least, if nothing else. Great. Thank you. Again, thank you very much. We're going to just take a few minutes and go over how alcohol works. What we've been asked to do is to kind of give you a primer on alcohol in the state of Maryland a little bit. We'll tell you a little bit about who we are. We that first one, we'd appreciate it. We'll tell you a little bit about who we are and what we do today, what we used to do, and kind of how we got here, starting just briefly with pre-prohibition. Not going to stay on it long, and we'll get you into the 2000s rather quickly, and then we'll talk a little bit about our structure and maybe some of the alcohol or tobacco-related trends that you might see throughout this session, things that may come up for you. Okay, the Alcohol Tobacco Commission was created by House Bill 1052 in 2019. It was set to kick off on July 1st, 2020. And enter COVID-19, and that put a delay in this. So the General Assembly delayed the opening 6 months, and we actually started operation as the Alcohol and Tobacco Commission on January 1st, 2021. So we've just celebrated 2 years in operation. It was a little bit, we were a little concerned and maybe curious how this was going to work out, because previously we were a part of the Comptroller's Office, the regulatory authority was, and we were the alcohol, we were then the Field Enforcement Division, and we did a whole bunch of things in addition to alcohol and tobacco. Actually, the transition went really smoothly. For the first several months, we have an MOU in place with the Comptroller. We still receive certain services from that office now, largely in HR, IT, and procurement. We package everything we need into a bundle, and they pull the levers or push the buttons necessary just to complete the transactions for us. But that has gone very well. Operationally, our agents on both sides, the Comptroller's Office and the ATC, shared responsibilities and worked together a lot for the first few months, and now we've received additional staffing, they've received additional staffing, and our missions are very different, and we've pretty much bifurcated how we do that. We just support each other as allied agencies for the time being. So our mission is to oversee the alcohol and the tobacco industries. We make sure that the people who are in the industries and are legitimate play by the rules, that it's a level playing field for everybody, that taxes are paid, that the trade practices are followed, and we essentially act as umpires or referees trying to keep everybody on the field and playing properly. And we also have law enforcement authority, which allows us to go after the bad actors, the people who smuggle product into the state, which is largely around tobacco products and cigarettes. But we have law enforcement authority to try to get rid of the contraband industry, the illegal industry, so that it's fair for the people who have legitimate businesses in the state, and so that we try to minimize the impact of the illegal industries that would come into the state. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this chart, and then we'll get into some other slides, but I'll probably go through some of these slides quickly, or maybe even just bypass them, because we'll talk about some of the details here. So you have packages, you have the slide presentation, you should have hard copies as well, at least some of them, and you'll be able to use those if you need any more information. And always, as a commercial, always contact any of us. You'll have our contact information if you need help with anything relative to these industries. We are very effective when you have community problems. If you have a licensed business especially that's creating problems for you or for your neighborhoods or constituents, we're very effective at making inroads. So please contact us directly, and we will work on that problem. We'll put it top front and center and get issues taken care of. Okay, the structure of the Alcohol and Tobacco Commission is we are an independent agency, and we report directly to the governor. We have essentially two silos. The first silo, and the reason we exist, is the silo of our commissioners. They are 5 appointed commissioners appointed by the governor, and then with the advice and consent of the Senate, they take their positions. They are 4-year terms on a rotating basis, so every year you have another commissioner up for reappointment or replacement, except for in 1 year you have 2. The obligation or the role of the commissioners is to establish best practices for the industry, to conduct studies, give some reports, advise the governor, and consider different regulations, promulgation of different regulations. They're involved in public health. They are involved in law enforcement. There are industry experts, as Commissioner Buck would be able to certainly stand that test. And there are some people who are knowledgeable of financial elements as well. So what I'd say is we now, the ATC side, the Office of the Executive Director is the second silo, and that's where the workers are who actually day-to-day conduct the regulatory and licensing function. So we have two divisions. The first division is the Field Operations Division. That is led by Bill George. He's the director of the Field Operations Division. I'm going to let Bill speak in just a couple of minutes to tell you what he does. But he has two really major subcomponents. One of them is the Field Operations Bureau. Those are our sworn police officers who will go out and do investigations for you. We do the inspections. We have fairly broad powers in doing those inspections. This is a group of very mature police officers, and I say that because most of them have had careers somewhere else and have retired and come here. So they've demonstrated through 20 or more years in other agencies that they're mature, that they approach scenarios in a smart manner, that they're respectful to people. We get very, very few complaints about the way our sworn officers interact with the legal industry, citizens, and even the people who are conducting nefarious activity. We don't get complained on because we're smart, we're mature, and we present that in the way we deal with people. The other element is the heart and soul and the reason we exist, and that's the Administrative Services Bureau that is led by Lisa Henneman. Lisa is she's an assistant director, and she is where the licensing happens. If your constituents are trying to get an application through, it goes to Lisa's crew. If there's a bit of research that needs to be done or reports written, it goes to Lisa. If there are issues of trade practices, which are all the regulations surrounding alcohol and tobacco, it goes to Lisa. If there are the inspections that have to be done to just get set up in business, it goes to Lisa. So really, the rest of us kind of exist to support Lisa's operation. The other division we have is the Legal and Legislative Division, and that is led by Mr. Tom Ackers. Tom is an attorney, and he takes care of our interaction with the legislature and as well provides a ton of legal advice. And I'm going to let each of these gentlemen speak a little bit more in detail about what they do, and then we'll resume. Can you go past that, because I've already done that. Thank you. Bill?
Good morning, Mr. Chair and committee members. My name is Bill George. I'm the director of the Field Enforcement Division for the Alcohol and Tobacco Commission, which is the part of the agency that is mandated by law to be a police agency. It houses two bureaus, as Jeff said. We have a Field Operations Bureau that is staffed by sworn police officers, and our Regulatory Administrative Services Bureau, which is truly, everything revolves around that. They issue thousands of statewide licenses to our wholesalers and distributors and manufacturers of alcohol and tobacco. They house the trade practice unit that works with those individuals attempting to get licensed and maintains contact with them and works out any issues that they have. And we investigate any complaints that, the trade practice investigators investigate complaints that we may get relative to their operations. We also we compile our own reports that are required by the legislature, and we have researchers in that unit, and it's a very, very active unit. The Field Operations Bureau carries out a robust inspection program throughout the state at all of our retailers of alcohol and tobacco and electronic smoking devices. They impose enforcement pretty much for every violation that we encounter, and we work collaboratively throughout the state with most municipal agencies and county agencies and other state agencies to carry out our mission, and federal agencies as well. And as Jeff said, we are staffed with a very high level of competent individuals who are seasoned police officers who have been very well vetted before they came into the organization. And it's generally when we're leaving, any encounter we have, whether it's enforcement, education, or routine random inspections, we're being thanked for the visit. So that's about all I have.
Yeah, no, thanks, Bill. All right, Tom, go ahead.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name is Thomas Akris. I serve as the Director of the Legal and Legislative Division. And I think Mr. Kelly started off by saying he feels like he's one of the luckiest guys to have the best job. I feel that way, too. I come to the ATC by way of Baltimore City, where I, on various careers, served as an Assistant State's Attorney, Assistant City Solicitor, and was Deputy Director of the Liquor Board for Baltimore City, and General Counsel there. And I took from that experience that true leadership is showing where leadership isn't caring necessarily about power, but how do you empower people? How do you provide back to the community? And that's really the culture that's set forth with the ATC. We want businesses to be set up and thrive. And my goal is to ensure that all of these businesses that are applying for application, that are every day doing the jobs of our manufacturers and distributors, getting alcoholic beverages or tobacco products through the right chains to the retailers, is done in compliance with the law. And so a number of the things that I do to support that effort are reviewing legislation, for instance, through the legislature. There are approximately 80 to maybe 90 bills each legislative session that deal with alcoholic beverages and tobacco. Our office is in charge of reviewing that legislation, providing some comments when necessary, advising the local jurisdictions, of which there are 25 separate alcoholic beverages boards around the state of Maryland, and going through that process, preparing for the hearings both in the House and in the Senate. We all, in this office, also oversees the administrative hearing process. We have now, I started with the ATC in January of 2022. We have built up an administrative hearing process where we hear violations against manufacturers and wholesalers in the state of Maryland if they act outside of the lines. Again, what we want to do is ensure warm compliance with our manufacturers and distributors, but if our agents go out, find violations, those are reported through the chain, they are charged. And our hearing officer is actually my Assistant Director, Jeff Han. He's seated out there. He is also a former state's attorney with the City of Baltimore and was a special U.S. attorney in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Baltimore City. So he has a wide experience dealing with administrative matters. To a point that the Mr. George stated, we issue, if there are around the state, there are approximately 9,500 alcoholic beverage licenses. There are approximately 5,500 tobacco-related licenses, and that's across the state of Maryland. So our inspectors and investigators are working with local jurisdictions to investigate those issues, bring any kind of compliance issues to us. Out of that body of licenses that I spoke about, our agency issues about 816 licenses and thousands of permits. To give you an example, we issue 37,000 vehicle permits a year. We issue thousands of festival permits. So all of these things need to ensure that they are legally compliant with the law and that actors, when receiving licensure, are doing the right things. We also issue alcohol compliance bulletins, which give guidance to manufacturers and distributors in the state of Maryland as to what is the right way to follow the law. And we are an open door to all the 25 jurisdictions who, some of which don't have county attorneys in their jurisdiction to explain the alcoholic beverages law. This is a very niche area of law, and a lot of jurisdictions may not have the capacity to really understand or parse the alcoholic beverages article. It's actually one of the biggest articles in all of the state of Maryland. So we serve as that resource to the 25 counties, and to echo what Mr. Kelly said, we stand ready. I stand ready. If you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to reach out to me.
Thanks, Tom. Great. So that's who we are. So I'll tell you a little bit about what our three-tier system looks like and kind of how we got here. First, pre-prohibition, and I promise I won't spend a whole lot of time on this, but it's kind of interesting. What started this, for the most part, was beer. It was beer manufactured in Europe, and they were selling a lot of beer into the United States. And I read a white paper years ago on Chicago and how things got started there. The beer industry, the out-of-country beer industry, wanted to really bolster business in the United States. So, and their goal was to get something like one saloon for every 165 people or so of drinking age in the city. One saloon for just that few. And in reality, they got close to it. They got to something like one saloon for maybe every 230, 240 people in Chicago, which is why you see in Chicago and in many big towns, why there's a bar on every corner. Because these, from way back when, these manufacturers in Europe were pushing this. And the idea was, If you were here and you had $100, $200 and you were willing to invest that, they would invest the rest of the money. They'd find a place for you to set up shop. They'd provide you with all the equipment. And the only thing you had to do was buy their beer and sell it. You could only buy their beer. You could buy nobody else's beer. There were no choices. You couldn't sell anything else but beer. And there's a term called tied house, meaning the manufacturer has a lot of control over the retailer. And here they had complete control. So all the retailer had to do was sell only that entity's beer, sell a lot of it, and then pay a small fee as a surcharge to start paying back for some of the other expenses they put out. So what that led to is you had a bar at one corner and another corner of the same block fighting each other, and they started offering things to bring in business because they had to meet their quotas. They started offering free meals. We ban that today. They started offering gaming operations. They started offering prostitution, drug usage, giving away things, a variety of things for free, enticing people to drink more. That led to, if you would, Tom, that led to a problem for our country. There was just a general loss of public decorum. There was, families were adversely impacted, and it became a very bad scene, such that we did something that the country doesn't do a lot. We passed an amendment that banned the manufacturing, sale, or transportation of alcohol. So the 18th Amendment comes in. That's just saying generally setting our policy for the country. And then Congress passed something called the Volstead Act. And the Volstead Act got into a little bit more detail about how things were going to be prohibited. And the Volstead Act then also provided for each state to pass complementary legislation. And of all the states that were in the nation back then, only one never passed any complementary legislation to support the Volstead Act. Anybody want to guess? Maryland. Excellent, thank you. Maryland said, we're not going to do that. And I'm going to show you how we've always been a little bit of a rebel in this. Maryland says we're not passing any complementary legislation. And it so angered a congressman from Georgia that he made a statement that Maryland should be thrown out of the Union if they don't support the Volstead Act, if they don't support prohibition. We should be thrown out, which angered an editor of the Evening Sun. So he wrote an editorial in response, calling us the Maryland Free State, which is in part where we got our motto of being the Free State. And the long and short of it is, he said, Maryland should not pass any complementary legislation. We should secede from the Union before we embrace this or accept it. And he wrote it, decided not to publish it initially, but then several versions of it came out at different points over the years. But just an interesting little tidbit about our history. We're kind of rebellious. So Prohibition ends, 21st Amendment comes in, and now alcohol is no longer prohibited. And the federal government said, states, this is your problem, you guys deal with it. We're not going to tell you how to deal with alcohol. You guys figure it out on your own. But they did, the Rockefellers did commission a report by a couple of fellows named Fosdick and Scott. And the name of the report was Toward Liquor Control. And it identified a whole bunch of reasons we went into prohibition and ways to avoid that in the future. And they came up with a couple of things. They said, first, what we number one, our recommendation is all states should control alcohol. They should be the retailers, they should be the sellers, the wholesalers, they should just control the whole operation. 17 of the states in the country today are control states, and they control alcohol. They are the alcohol entity for the state. The rest of them don't. Option 2 was, if you don't do control, do licensing. At least state license all of the elements of this so you have some state control over every aspect of that. And almost all the other states are licensed states, and most all of the other states license everybody. They license the manufacturers, first tier, they license the distributors, the second tier, and they license the retailers, the third tier. Most states do that do licensing. But Maryland said, no, we're not doing that. Maryland decided to leave the retail obligation up to each of the local jurisdictions. Tom mentioned 25. There's the 23 counties, and Baltimore City and Annapolis City also each have independent control or authority over the retail application of alcohol. So Maryland, almost contrary to almost every other state in the country, decided to allow local jurisdictions to legislate, which kind of works because then each local jurisdiction gets to be relative to alcohol what it wants to be. So so we can go past this. Thanks. So this is what our alcohol distribution thinks it looks like. We have 3 distinct tiers. You may have heard of the 3-tiered system. This is the 3-tiered system. The first tier are the manufacturers or suppliers. And there's a subtle difference between who they are. They're either making the product or there's some out-of-country or out-of-state entity who makes it and introduces it into the state. Or there might be somebody else who makes it, as an example. Perhaps a European winery makes it, is not licensed in Maryland, but sells it to a wholesaler or so, or somebody in the United States that brings it into Maryland. That becomes a supplier, Tier 1. Tier 2 are our distributors and wholesalers, as Commissioner Buck has spent so much time being and experiencing. So they are the ones who distribute. So the manufacturer can only sell it to a wholesaler, and a wholesaler then can only sell it to a retailer. That's our third tier, all the various retail operations. And then they're the ones who are allowed to sell to consumers. That's what it's supposed to look like. But it gets a little complex because we've changed the laws over the year. So in Tier 1, I'll just spend a couple of minutes on this. Tier 1, where it's lavender, those are traditional manufacturers. In every class of licensing, those are the ones who actually do make product. In the light blue under Tier 1, those are actually Tier 2 entities. They're like wholesalers. But I mentioned earlier that a European winery is not a licensed entity in Maryland. So they may be selling their product, introducing it into Maryland by way of one of our traditional Maryland wholesalers. In those instances, that wholesaler becomes the supplier of record, the Tier 1 supplier of record of that product. And they're a wholesaler also. So we start to blur those very bright lines that separated the tiers start to get blurred. And still under Tier 2, you can see that we have some of that lavender color. That's because we've now created licenses that allow manufacturers to be, on a limited basis, wholesalers as well. And then lastly, we have just the vessels, aircraft, and railroad. They're just an odd entities anyway, and so we allow them to buy, in some cases, directly from manufacturers or from wholesalers. We'll move over to the third tier, which is the retail operation. Again, that's meant to be just where retailers are selling to consumers, and the light green shows that's what they do, a variety of different license classes. But then there's this multi-tier element as well. Again, manufacturers. So we allow, in Maryland, we allow a manufacturer to also, in limited circumstances, be a wholesaler, and in limited circumstances, be a retailer. So they are able to cross all three bright lines. So it's actually much more complex. We won't spend any time on this except to say it's fairly complex how alcohol moves through the state. I think we really understand it. It works. There is logic to it, so we've figured out ways that it works and we understand it. But it's our job to try and keep these tiers separated or people stay within their lanes when they're distributing and using alcohol. I'm not going to go over any of these except to tell you that we have a lot of different classes of licenses and permits. There's many of them here. The explanations and costs of them are all on these pages, and you're happy to look at them, and we'll answer any questions you have, specific ones, but there's just a lot of them. And you know, as Tom was saying, we have a lot of licenses and a lot of permits, and it ends up being tens of thousands of these that we issue or renew every year. So now we'll talk a little bit about our tobacco laws. So tobacco's interesting too. It's very interesting. First thing is cigarettes. Cigarettes are some kind of tobacco and maybe even other product that's wrapped up with something that's not tobacco. So it has to be wrapped up with paper. I mean, if you could smoke it, I guess you could wrap it with wood, with anything, but it can't be with tobacco. So cigarettes, very narrowly defined, tobacco rolled with something other than a tobacco product itself. And that second area, referencing commercial law, we get a lot of questions about what people call loosies, which is when a store may open up a pack of cigarettes and sell them individually at inflated prices. That's prohibited under the Commercial Article Act, under the commercial law. You can't sell unpackaged cigarettes. Just can't do it. We do investigations of those. We see, you know, it's easy to figure out when somebody's doing it. We might send somebody and make a quick undercover buy and take appropriate action. That's cigarettes. And cigarettes, interestingly, receive tobacco stamps sold by the comptroller in rolls of 30,000. They get these stamps that are affixed to every pack. So for us doing an inspection, Bill's gang will go out and do the inspections, and they can just look very quickly. You'll see, if you pay attention, you go into a store that has cigarettes, you're going to see all the cigarettes up on the display shelf probably all have the tobacco tax stamps being out, so that we have to be in the stores as little as possible. We can look very quickly to see our tax stamps there. Distribution system for cigarettes, manufacturers make them. They're all over the country. They go to our wholesalers, who are the ones who actually stamp it. That's the bottleneck or the point at which taxation takes place. They apply the stamp, and then they sell them to either sub-wholesalers or directly to retailers who sell them to consumers. We can skip this one and the next one now. Go past that. Thank you. Other tobacco products. So if it's not a cigarette, it's an other tobacco product, which is the legal term for everything else. We refer to it as OTP, but other tobacco products are almost everything else you can think of. That's a tobacco-related issue. It could be a cigar. It could be wraps that you see that other tobacco gets wrapped in. It could be snus. It could be snuff. It could be dissolvables. A few years ago, our definition of other tobacco products was so limited that the industry was making new products and would send them to us and say, can we sell these in Maryland? And we're looking at them, and there's no prohibition because our law was so narrow as to what other tobacco products were. They had to be able to sell them, but they weren't taxed except for a sales tax, because we couldn't put them in the category of being OTP. A few years ago, you guys changed, very significantly broadened the law of OTP. They gave us something that works today, and I think will work for us in the future as well as new products come on board. And we're really grateful for that. So it makes it easier for us to understand what it is and how to regulate it, and it makes these products excise taxable as well as sales tax. So appreciate that. We'll go on to the next one. Electronic smoking devices, they're difficult in some ways. They came out a long time ago before anybody regulated them, anybody knew what they were. All the states, and it's not just Maryland, all the states were stymied from taking any action because we needed the FDA to rule on whether these were tobacco products, which would be under our regulation then, or are these smoking cessation devices, which would put them in FDA and out of our area. And it took them years. This product was all over the place before the FDA finally came down and said these are tobacco products and now regulate them. So Maryland's done what it can to start to rein this in. There are no excise taxes on electronic smoking devices, which are the devices themselves. It's any vaping liquid that may be used also. There's no excise tax. But there is, I guess, a compounded sales tax. So at least with electronic smoking devices and vaping liquid, they're taxed, the sales tax, at 12%. No excise tax, but do get a 12% sales tax. One exception is small little cartridges that are meant to be replacement cartridges for systems that come in 5 milliliters or less are taxed at 60%. And I didn't bring that over, but I'll get you all, just so you'll have it, a little listing of the taxes, various taxes that are applied to alcohol and where it takes place. And also, hopefully it'll be easy to understand, and tobacco as well, of how it's taxed and where it's taxed. And we can pass by this. This was a stroke of genius, quite frankly, for the General Assembly. The premium cigar market is huge, and it's largely outside of Maryland. We have a premium cigar market in Maryland. We have licensed entities called tobacconists. They're people who sell 70% or more product is tobacco related, and they are the people who sell the very expensive cigars or maybe expensive quality cigarettes. And the concern for our in-state tobacconists has always been they pay excise tax at 15% of the product of the wholesale cost, and they have to charge sales tax on top of all of that. But out-of-state entities didn't have to do anything. They didn't have to be registered with us. They could sell direct to consumers. They didn't have to pay an excise tax. They didn't have to pay a sales tax. So they had an incredible advantage over our own businesses in Maryland. And a couple of years ago, the General Assembly passed a law and created a new license called the Remote Tobacco Seller's License. And first in the nation, we figured out a way, you guys figured out a way, to add an excise tax and require an out-of-state seller, first requiring the out-of-state seller to get our permit to sell into the state, and then secondly, and they're willing to do this now, by the way, because they understand they have to do business here, secondly, to apply an excise tax on that product and a Maryland state sales tax on that product. So now, out-of-state entities are playing fairly relative to our tobacconists or other premium cigar sellers in the state. They are paying an excise tax and they are paying a sales tax when they make these sales into the state. So kudos, because that's something that, as first in the nation, some states charge sales tax, none of them do excise and sales tax. And this is being used as a model for other states to figure out how to solve this problem for themselves. And this is just another commercial thing. One day, if you guys, and I know you have a 90 busy days, so if you want to do it off session, well, that's fine. And you may not want to. But right across the street in the Treasury building, we have several holding rooms in our basement, secure holding rooms that are filled with contraband product. If you ever just want to get a sense of how much stuff we get. And we're constantly cycling through this. Some of it is evidence. A lot of it is evidence that we use in trial. Once the trial's properly adjudicated, we dispose of the items in accordance as we're allowed to. In some instances, the trials never happen, so we hold on to some pretty old product. In some instances, it's just contraband, just flat contraband that we seize. And after a period of time where someone can have a hearing to get the contraband back, we dispose of the property then. But if you get 15 minutes and you want to see what some of this looks like, we'll be happy to arrange that for you. And it's pretty interesting. It's a little smelly, but it's interesting. Yeah. Next. I'm going to ask Tom to go over things that you might see coming up this legislative session relative to alcohol or tobacco, just things that have come up in the past. We're not taking positions on this. We're just letting you know that you might see these, and some of them have been continuous issues. So Tom, if you would, please.
Thank you. First up is the Alcohol Tobacco Commission's corrective and clarification bills. If you recall, in 2019, House Bill 1052 was passed, which created the Alcohol Tobacco Commission, and then subsequent to 2019 and 2020, in 2021, and in 2022, there have been clarification bills that have been passed by this body. Just last year, this body passed legislation which would allow transfer the power of from the comptroller to the Alcohol Tobacco Commission to verify fire-safe cigarettes. These are cigarettes that go through the full burn process to make sure they self-extinguish. Those cigarettes used to cause a lot of house fires years ago, and so we have now taken over that. But that's just an example of the authorities that still need to be transitioned over from the comptroller to the Alcohol Tobacco Commission. All of the permits that we mentioned earlier, from transportation permits to storage permits, those are still in the name of the comptroller, although we issue them. And so to ensure that the Alcohol Tobacco Commission has the complete regulatory and enforcement power that this body transitioned over in 2019, there'll be a corrective bill introduced this session, or we're hoping that a corrective bill will be introduced this session to kind of transition those authorities over. The continuation of direct shipping for manufacturers for off-premise sales. If you recall, during the pandemic, the governor issued an executive order which allowed manufacturers to direct ship to consumers. This emergency power was legislated in 2021, and it extended the ability for manufacturers to provide this service to consumers. Last legislative session, it was extended again until June 30th, 2022, allowing Maryland manufacturers to direct ship. This is an issue that will probably come before the legislature. Grocery chain stores. These bills have been introduced in the past, both in 2021 and in 2022, which would authorize grocery chain stores to sell beer and wine. Currently, there is a statewide prohibition on grocery stores obtaining a retail packaged goods store license. Next, the third party, and just following up on that, the bills that were introduced last year allowed for licensure in the state, Baltimore City, and Prince George's County. So you saw separate bills coming up from different jurisdictions. Third party and Uber delivery. So currently, alcoholic beverages are allowed to be delivered, we're not talking about direct ship, but by retailers directly to consumers. So an individual that is employed by the retail establishment has to deliver those products to ensure the individual that purchased them is at the door. The person is 21 years or older and can receive those alcoholic beverages. A lot of local liquor boards will keep records or will ensure that the local licensee keeps records to ensure that we can track that when you deliver, you're actually delivering to someone 21 and older. There are some third-party and Uber delivery services that want to get involved in this chain, and they are not employees of the retail establishment and don't have to go through some of the trainings that the retail establishments have to go to, i.e. every licensee of a retail establishment has to obtain an alcohol awareness certification. And that also deals with ensuring folks that receive alcohol should be receiving alcohol. And then lastly, ready-to-drink cocktails. There was legislation that was introduced last session which would have changed the tax rates for ready-to-drink cocktails. Currently, Maryland's excise tax rate, and this would have hit the excise tax, Maryland's excise tax rate is $1.50 for spirits per gallon. For wine, it's 40 cents per gallon, and for beer, it's 9 cents per gallon. The bills that were introduced last year would have lowered the amount of excise tax that spirit-based ready-to-go cocktails would pay from $1.50 a gallon to 40 cents a gallon. Those bills did not pass last legislative session, but there was a request by the JCR that the Alcohol Tobacco Commission commission a study for the purposes of looking at how other states have defined low-proof spirits and what the tax rates are. So we're still working on that study. That study should be out by March 1st, 2023. And then tobacco-related issues. There were some bills that were introduced last year that would have allowed local regulation in regards to the distribution and enforcement of state laws. This is important. Back, I believe, in 2013, there was a Court of Appeals case that essentially said the power to regulate and enforce tobacco laws lies with the state and not the counties, because some local jurisdictions were attempting to pass legislation regulating the distribution of tobacco products. There were some bills last year that were crafted that would have allowed the passage of state law to allow localities to regulate and enforce tobacco laws. Those did not pass. And then there was a zoning enforcement bill from Prince George's County, which would have added additional zoning restrictions at the state law level to limit the concentration of tobacco retail establishments. So that was something else. And then considerations for cannabis. What is the role of the ATC? With the passage of the referendum in November last year, the legislature will be working on legislation which will create a commercial market for individuals 21 and over. And there's a question as to what is the role for our agency. House Bill 837 that was passed last year in the uncodified section required the Maryland Medical Cannabis Commission and the Alcohol Tobacco Commission to conduct a study of what our structure would look like. This was not dealing with regulation. This was not dealing with taxation. But what would the physical structure look like if we were to combine agencies? This report was published in November of last year. If any member of the committee needs a copy of that, we can forward that to staff counsel. And then just some other items, distribution systems, promulgating regulations, how will this all work? And inspection and enforcement authority, and I want to just hone in on this inspection and enforcement authority for a second. When our inspectors go out and they're tackling, for instance, I'll use alcohol and tobacco, an illegal market with alcohol. Fells Point is a really good example. This past year, we were doing enforcement activities in Fells Point, and there were individuals that we found that had bars set up on the back of their trunk in Fells Point, and were making mixed cocktails and selling them to go from the back of their trunk. Now, that's rectifying without a license. It's also selling alcohol without a license. There are a whole list of charges. But what our officers, along with the comptroller's officers who were present there, were able to issue criminal citations which were engaging in sales without a retail license, not having a sales and use tax account. And these are criminal citations, these are misdemeanors. But what it allowed us to do was, we're not perp walking individuals who are in this illegal illicit market. We're giving them criminal citation, and it allows us to take the contraband. That was the biggest piece of it. So when we're talking about an illicit market, this is the way. It's not, and in terms of the kind of disposition of those cases, they go to district court, and for the most part, they're either steaded or nolle prossed, but the property is forfeited. So if we think about what contraband tobacco looks like, and we are in just another case, we were in West Baltimore over the summer, and there were a number of retailers who we found were selling out-of-state cigarettes. These are cigarettes purchased in Virginia or purchased in Pennsylvania, where, for instance, the tax on a pack of cigarettes here is $3.75. In Virginia, I believe it's 50 cents. 30 cents. So you see a lot of individuals that will go down to Virginia, buy cigarettes, bring them to Maryland, and sell them and pocket that $3.45. So what we would do is issue a criminal citation, take all of that illegal contraband, and when going forward with the district court case, if it's a STED or a nolle pros or a PBJ, again, forfeit that property to ensure that the illicit market doesn't thrive. And then last, other things, advertising and things of value. We can go over this if there are any questions about relationships between wholesalers and distributors and retailers, ensuring that wholesalers and manufacturers are not giving things of values to retailers so as to put their products at an advantage to other manufacturers' products. And here are our points of contact.
Yep, good. Thanks, Tom. Just to underscore real quick about that tobacco stuff, I appreciate you mentioning that. The difference between a Maryland pack of cigarettes and a Virginia pack of cigarettes, it's the same cost of the cigarette. It's the tax. It's $3. It's $3.45 more for a Maryland pack of cigarettes. Now, we don't go to any place, and sometimes we'll go to Virginia. There are places we know cater to smugglers and illegal operations. And the people that are involved in these aren't mom and pop, and they're not somebody trying to save a couple of dollars and bring back some cartons for their friends and neighbors. These are people these are criminal organization enterprises who make a living out of smuggling tobacco, from cigarettes specifically, from Virginia into Maryland. And we might make a seizure of 1,000 cases. 1,000 cartons, which is about 12 or 13 cases, which are only, each case is only this big. It's not that big. 1,000 cartons. Well, that's $34,000 plus for one trip. And if we take them off, they're not terribly concerned because they're going to go another day and try and get that money back rather quickly. So they're able to make a lot of money, and they're not necessarily giving bargains, but what some of them are doing is a slight reduction in sales, opening up the trunk of their cars. And I've used this example before. It's almost like watching pigeons flock around a piece of bread that you throw down. People come from everywhere when they see certain vehicles open up knowing the cigarettes are here at a slightly reduced rate, and they sell out in minutes. It takes no time. We've observed some of this. It just takes no time. On the other tobacco product side, so we've got Virginia at 30 cents, well, we're $3.75. In Virginia, the other tobacco products, which are all these other products that aren't cigarettes, when a product is sold from a Virginia wholesaler for out-of-state sales, there's zero tax applied. So you've got the little white van goes up into Pennsylvania, loads up with other tobacco products which are being sold into Maryland stores. They pay 0% tax. They come into Maryland, and the Maryland retailers pay 0% tax. But a Maryland retailer who buys it like they're supposed to, from a wholesaler who buys it from a manufacturer, is paying 15% on premium cigars, a tax. They're paying 53% on all the other stuff except for cigars, 53%. They're paying 30% on pipe tobacco. They're paying 70% on the mass-produced cigars. So if you buy it legitimately for $1, you got to charge at least $1.70 to break even, but not if you get it from Pennsylvania. If you're buying it for $1, you can sell it for $1.50, make a decent income, and pay no tax to Maryland. And they're labor intensive. Those inspections are labor intensive, but our basement that I was telling you about has a lot of OTP. We make a lot of seizures on that. So it's really important stuff to make it fair for businesses, and the tax loss is huge in our state. So any questions? I'm happy to.
Any members got questions? Delegate Aaron's.
Is there a chance we get a copy of the slides?
Yes.
Absolutely. There are some hard copies around, and also we have, would you want just the electronic deck of it, or?
That would be fine for me.
We do have it, I think.
All right, thank you.
We'll make sure everybody gets a copy. We'll send it out to your offices. Okay? Yep. Delegate Adams.
Just real quick, Jeff, you talked about
Sure.
Guinness, right? So
Right.
that gets imported. Is the importer, so is there an entity in Maryland or in the United States that is the tier one? Do I understand it?
I believe that would be Diageo.
Diageo.
And correct. And Diageo, it does buy licenses from us. Plus, they have a location now, as many of you may be aware, the Open Gate Brewery in Baltimore County. And if you haven't been, it's a huge facility. But Diageo is the supplier for Guinness.
So the Guinness Stout is made in Ireland, gets shipped. Diageo then acts as the tier one, and then wholesales.
Yes, sir. And that's interesting because that shouldn't, in the typical tier one system, that wouldn't happen. In typical tier one, they couldn't send their finished product in here and have it sold necessarily through the brewery like they do. The stuff that you buy in bottles and cans, absolutely, that works the way it works, exactly as it's meant to. Yeah. And relative to the Guinness brewery itself, the one in Baltimore County, there are some exceptions to the general rule.
Is it the same deal like with Corona or Heineken? Same thing?
Not really, because they don't have a possession. They don't have a location in Maryland. They actually are what we would call a non-resident dealer, meaning they're. And interestingly, Anheuser-Busch is a non-resident dealer. Yeah. They're huge. They make this product, but they don't have a presence in Maryland. They sell their wares here, but they don't have a presence. So they make it wherever they make it, and then they ship it to a wholesaler. So the tier one in that case would be our non-resident dealer. Corona would be perhaps our tier one, supplying it to our distributors in the state who are our tier two distributors.
Yeah, so Diageo is a little unique in that setting. Okay.
It is very unique. It's one of those ones you have to, when somebody asks you a question, you got to get the book out.
The beer's good.
Real quick before we go to the next question, Ms. Denise already sent out the slides to your floor laptop, so you should have them in front of you. No? Oh, it's too big? Okay. All right, we will get them to you. Okay, they'll be posted on the floor system. Delegate Charkoudian.
Thank you. I just wanted to say you started earlier by saying something about there was 2 years ago where I reached out to your office. There was a great deal of confusion in the community about who was responsible, and asked you all to coordinate with our local county officials, and you did some fantastic work. And so I just wanted to say thank you. It was really
I appreciate the
helpful
feedback. Thank you. That's what we want to do. We want to be good servants, and it can be very, very frustrating. So what we'll do is, even if it's not our thing, we'll get involved and at least try to identify whose thing it is and then try and parse it out. So we'll do that for you, because I know it can be frustrating, very frustrating to get to the right people. We're probably a good gateway, even if we're not the people to do it. But thank you, really appreciate that. That means a lot, and the troops will appreciate hearing that.
Oh, sorry. Delegate Harrison.
Thank you. My question is around compliance and enforcement. And so it's, first of all, how many staff members do you have to do that? How often are they going out? And assuming that, you know, and are you properly staffed with that? And then assuming that the cannabis is going to come under your jurisdiction, you know, will you need to add more staff, and will they need to have specific training or specific knowledge?
Thank you, Delegate Harrison. I appreciate that. That's a good question. So are we sufficiently staffed? We're a growing agency. Well, I mean, we are an agency that's still standing up. You know, we've been doing this for 2 years. I would say last budget year, we did ask for a considerable increase in staffing, and we got close to what we asked for. So we're really thrilled with that. And in fact, it's difficult to hire. It's difficult to hire quickly. So while we had these positions on July 1st, we just filled the last 5 of them last Wednesday. The last 5 started for us just last Wednesday. So we have sworn staff, Bill, but as far as the actual people on the road, 4 supervisors and maybe, does that sound right? Maybe about 16 or so, 15, 16 agents. And that's not a lot. And it covers the state. And I know we might think we're a small state. Population-wise, we're not. You heard Tom mention how many licensed locations that we get involved in inspecting. We don't get to do them all every year, but we try to do enough to make an impact and then visit some others throughout different years. So we can always make use of whatever we get, but we have enough to maintain where we are, and we think we're fairly effective because we do target areas just to make sure we're not doing the same place all the time. We keep track of where we've been so that we go to other places and not just re-inspect unwarrantedly a location that's been inspected most recently. With cannabis coming on board, yes, ma'am, we are going to need, I think, some help. We're going to need some staffing help. The training that goes into that is, I think, going to be very unique. What we've done so far is we've met with Oregon officials and Washington State, because they've been doing this for 10 years, and I happen to know them personally because they also are the alcohol regulators for those states, and I happen to just know them from my tenure. And they were very helpful and gave us a lot of information, gave us a lot of pitfalls, things they experienced, trouble they experienced, so we're going to learn from them. And earlier in the spring, we started meeting with Will Tilburg from the Cannabis Commission and his team so that we could put this report together that Tom referenced. And we've started to learn an awful lot about what they do. And yes, I think there's going to be, it's going to require a lot of training, but what we have, fortunately, is within the operations of the Cannabis Commission are a lot of inspectors who know the work. We're going to be able to share some of what they've known with our agents, so that's going to be very helpful. But I think we're going to need a significantly increased agent staff and at least some logistics inside. And really, it's a whole different thing. We need to look at community outreach. We need to let people know, how do you get these licenses? What are the obstacles to it, or what are the difficulties, or how do you overcome some of these? We think we're going to have other roles now besides just enforcement and regulation. We think we're going to have to get the message out there about how this works and how people can get into the industry. So, we're working on that now. I mean, I think shortly, like within days to a week or so, we're going to have something. I think with a little bit more detail. Thank you.
All right. I know the chair will be disappointed, but for the first of many questions, we'll go to Delegate Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You mentioned the taxation outside of Maryland for tobacco, and that there's this huge incentive, of course, to pirate tobacco, if you will, from outside the state and bring it inside the state, because the price is so inexpensive relative to Maryland. Has the commission ever done a study to find if we would actually collect more revenue by lowering the tax rate? Just curious.
We have, and I'd say first, the studies that we do would be generally based on requests from the General Assembly. So we haven't received such a request, and we haven't. I would say that there is data over the years where we've seen an increase in the cigarette tax, where we've seen where that would lead to fewer, because I don't really know how much may be coming in from outside of the state. So the data would show there may have been fewer sales of cigarette stamps, which is how we were able to figure out what the sales are, fewer cigarette stamps, but the overall income was greater. The state income was greater because of the increase in the rate. But the number of cigarette stamps that were sold would be reduced slightly. But I don't have any, there's no official study on that.
Okay. Thank you, appreciate it.
Sure.
Delegate Aaron's.
With all the increase in, let's say, marijuana and all the other drinks, specialty drinks we see out there, has there been any outside pressure to bring back alcohol?
To
Revisit alcohol, potted alcohol.
No, sir. Delegate Anderson, it hasn't been, and I haven't, except for just occasionally reading about it in our laws, just reviewing things, I haven't heard about that in a few years. Not since it was really an issue here in the state and then was finally banned. I haven't heard it being brought up again.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure.
Delegate Chi.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, Mr. Kelly, I want to commend you for a succinct and informative presentation. I think this was one of the best I have heard of all briefings. You turned a complex subject into a delightfully understandable presentation, so thank you. And I'm also pleased to see that what we voted on in 2019 seems to be working out fine. My question is, in case I missed it, what proportion is your alcohol enforcement versus tobacco? And with the cannabis reform coming on the horizon, what do you foresee is the balance? Thank you.
Well, that's really a good question. From a regulatory standpoint, and by that I mean like offering advice and opinions and help to the industries, most of our time is spent with alcohol. They're the ones where we spend more time giving advice, providing instruction, helping them stay compliant with trade practices. But from an enforcement standpoint, we spend a lot more time with tobacco. I mean, it's overwhelming because there's so much contraband product coming in, and it's a fairly decent self-policing industry when other retailers are saying, "Hey, this guy is killing me. You know, they're selling a ton of stuff, and I'm not, and I'm buying it legitimately, and they can't be. Can you just check them? Can you just go do an inspection? Inspection yields." You know, they're labor intensive because cigarettes have stamps on them. Other tobacco products do not. So it's really an audit of invoices compared to product that we make our cases from. But so enforcement wise, it's good Lord, it could be 70%, 80% tobacco. Regulatory advising trade practices is probably the same, leaning toward alcohol. With cannabis, you know, they say it takes, what we think we've learned so far is it takes about 3 to 4 times to do a cannabis inspection, an inspection of a cannabis operation, than it does to do an alcohol or tobacco. And these are coming from Washington and Oregon, who do both as well. So it takes longer. So I think the amount of time we'll have to spend in these locations is probably going to be greater. The benefit, though, is I've had the opportunity to tour growers and processors and dispensaries for cannabis, and a cannabis package at a dispensary, every one of them is labeled, has a certain label on it with a certain number, and it is a unique number to the plant that it came from. So by having that number, you can find out whatever that end product is, whether it's a joint or it's an edible or a gummy, an oil, whatever it might be, it's labeled, and you can find out who processed it, and then you can also find out who grew it originally, and then you can even get the date, when did they plant the seed, when did they move it to a small cultivation room, to a larger just grow room. You can follow its entire history. So that part is nice, but I can see why it takes longer because it's a lot to research. But I think it becomes a tighter, it's tighter control.
Good. All right. Seeing no more questions, I want to thank you all for your briefing, and this concludes today's hearing. Thank you.
Thank you very much.